Hello and welcome to Environmental Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this essay, we're going to be taking a look at a seminal essay by Christopher Stone called Do Trees Have Standing? And we're going to examine some of his groundbreaking positions regarding nature and specifically how trees might actually possess legal rights and what the implications are for both environmental ethics and the legal system. Of course, we'll be emphasizing the ethical side since this is not a legal course and I'm not a legal scholar by any stretch of the imagination. Now, let's begin by contextualizing our discussion. In our previous video, we've been talking about anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism. And in particular, we looked at Holmes Rollston III's essay, The Value of Nature and the Nature of Value, in which he articulated a different conception of value. Instead of focusing on the idea that value is merely something that is attributed by subjective beings such as ourselves, and which divides into we're intrinsically valuable and everything else is just something useful to us or has instrumental value. Instead, Rollston argued that there's actually, as it were, layers of value that exist within nature, and that you don't have to have something like a subjective being in order to say that something has value. And this is of course, opens up a theoretical lens for thinking about the ways in which we might attribute a non-anthropocentric sense of value to nature. And also, we'll remember, Rollston also distinguishes between three types of values. We have intrinsic values, instrumental values, but we also have systemic values, such that the system of the ecosystem or biosphere or systems themselves can have value. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to shift our focus from thinking about the abstract origin of values and start thinking about more of the practical implications of what happens when we acknowledge that nature does have an inherent worth or a systemic worth. And we're going to see here that Christopher Stone is going to explore how this recognition can be operationalized within our legal structure within the United States and within its implications for environmental ethics overall. So let's start by thinking about who Christopher Stone was. Christopher Stone was a legal scholar and he was also an educator. He was a prominent law professor at the University of Southern California, and he was known in particular for his work in environmental law and in particular environmental ethics. His work emphasized the necessity of recognizing legal rights for natural entities, that is, non-human entities. His most influential article is the one we're going to be talking about, Should Trees Have Standing?, published in 1972. And in this article, he challenged the traditional legal perception that ultimately the only people who really count legally are human beings, and instead offered up the idea that non-human entities, things such as trees, can actually have legal rights. And this actually ignited an important global discourse on the moral and legal rights of nature. And this actually leads to significant influence in environmental law. He would even be quoted later on. This essay would be quoted by a Supreme Court justice in one of his decisions. Now, here we go. Right. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas referenced his work in one of his dissenting opinions in the famous case Sierra Club versus Morton. And so Stone here is an important thinker, both ethically but legally. And his broader scholarship actually extended to thinking about property rights, global environmental law, and the moral status of non-human entities. So he's really an important figure within the legal community, at least within environmental law and environmental ethics. Now, let's begin here. And you're going to see I'm going to start off with a set of basic remarks, and then from there we're going to take a look at some of the more detailed exposition of his essay. The first thing we want to recognize is that there is indeed a historical pattern of expanding rights. Historically, rights have been extended to include marginalized groups over time. Think about the fact that when the U.S. Constitution was first written and passed into law, the U.S. Constitution only allowed voting rights for property owners who were men. Today, voting rights have now been extended, and not just voting rights, but civil rights laws have been extended to, number one, outlaw slavery, but to include persons of color, women, children, and others who were previously denied legal recognition. So one of the things we can recognize is that there's a historical expansion going on. Now, we have to be careful here that this historical expansion doesn't give us reason necessarily to say that we should extend rights to non-human entities, but it does show us that there is a historical trajectory taking place, such that it's not completely out of the question, as it were, at least in terms of our expectations of whether or not it could be a possibility. Now, this expansion of rights over time reflects ultimately a societal shift, a cultural shift in our understanding and our acknowledging the intrinsic value of all kinds of different persons and entities within the moral community. Now, nature's place in the rights evolution. So we're going to see here that Stone is going to argue that the same framework for recognizing rights for marginalized people can actually be applied to thinking about extending rights to include nature itself or non-human entities. He's going to question why, for instance, natural objects like trees and rivers should actually be excluded from this evolution of rights, ultimately suggesting that their intrinsic value actually warrants the fact that they should have legal standing in the same way that's similar to those persons who have gained rights and legal standing historically. So let's talk a little bit about legal standing, which is important. So we're not a legal class, this isn't a law class, but we need to understand, because it's a central concept that ultimately Christopher Stone's going to argue for. And again, I believe this article was published in the National Law Review. So the audience for this article was originally other lawyers and other philosophers of law. So we need to step back and take a little bit to understand the context of this article. So let's talk a little bit about the current legal framework. So in U.S. law, standing is this notion of who has the right to bring a case. And your right to bring a case depends upon whether or not you can demonstrate that you've been harmed by the action of another person. So, for instance, if I don't like something that someone says on TV and I sue them, right, I may not have standing because I have to demonstrate that I've been harmed by their actions, for instance. And here we're just ignoring the fact that people have the right to free speech. But standing requires you can't bring a case before a court unless you have standing, and you can't have standing unless there is some sort of harm that has occurred. So there has to be a sufficient connection to the harm and the action that you're challenging legally. Traditionally, of course, only human beings or their representatives have ever had legal standing, and this has always limited the ability to address certain types of environmental harms in a direct way. So, for instance, you can imagine that if you're clear-cutting a forest, for instance, it might be very difficult to argue to challenge that action, because who exactly has the legal standing? You can see here on the one hand, if the person who owns the forest or is in charge of it is fine with it, then there is no harm that's taking place. But clearly there can be environmental harm. So how can environmental harms translate into our legal system? Because our legal system is the practical and the functional means by which rights are actually protected. And keep in mind here that whenever we say that something has a moral right, a moral right, then that means someone else must have a moral responsibility to protect that right. Our legal system is organized along those lines, which means we need to be thinking about, could, for instance, rivers or trees actually gain legal standing? So Stone's going to argue that we should indeed grant legal standing to natural objects. This, of course, raises some fundamental and important questions. For instance, how can a tree present itself in court and say that it's being harmed? And we're going to see he's going to provide us a mechanism that already exists within the law in order for something like that to be challenged. But this also means that Stone's going to challenge these traditional views and suggest that nature should indeed have representatives within legal proceedings. Now, the historical expansion of rights, of course, have included such marginal groups as women, children, and minorities or persons of color. And this pattern suggests that legal recognition for nature is indeed a logical step within the evolution of rights. So, Given that, what we're going to be talking about here, at least, or what Stone's going to argue, is that we need to grant legal standing to these non-human entities, but he's going to offer us a framework for understanding how that might actually be possible. So let's kind of walk through just the beginning here and say and echo his argument that nature deserves legal standing. He actually argues that natural objects like rivers and trees and ecosystems should indeed be recognized as holding rights, with the ability to actually have legal representation. So in other words, he's going to argue that the natural entities should have rights, but they have to also have legal representation within our system. Now, creates a sort of weird condition because, as we mentioned before, rivers can't exactly speak up for themselves. So this proposal ultimately leads to something of a shift within the legal paradigm, allowing for something like a direct advocacy on the behalf of nature. It's not just arguing that nature should be protected for another human being's instrumental needs, but ultimately for the intrinsic value that it has within itself. And this might allow for a sort of direct advocacy on behalf of natural entities, similar to how the way guardians represent children or those who are incapable of representing themselves within court. So this means that guardianship becomes the model for natural objects. Keep in mind here that, for instance, children, let's imagine an infant or a 3-year-old. If an infant is harmed in some sort of way, or a small child is harmed, they're unable to actually represent or even articulate what harm has occurred to them. But they do have rights. This is not controversial. All of us recognize this. So in our legal system, we have this notion of guardianship, where guardianship is the model by which a person who can't speak for themselves can actually find legal representation and find advocacy. Notice that, for instance, parents are guardians of their children, which means that if a child is harmed, the parent can bring to the court a charge, or at least seek representation within a legal proceeding in order to rectify that harm. So guardianship becomes our basic model. Which allows for objects like trees, rivers, and ecosystems to have legal representation in the court, even though they can't speak for themselves. And this would enable us to actually recognize their intrinsic value and interest, not just in a moral and philosophical sense, but in a legal, practical sense. So this model ensures that their rights might be defended without simply relying solely on human plaintiffs to demonstrate harm. Right now, for instance, or you might say in an ordinary way, most people would argue that the only way, for instance, that we can stop an environmental harm is to show that a human being has been harmed. But here, he suggests that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Instead, we can think of human beings as guardians, where the rights holders are the natural entities themselves. So by appointing guardians for natural objects, the legal system can actually address environmental harm in a more effective way. Instead of just trying to address environmental harm in an indirect sense, this might create a possibility in which we can directly actually address environmental issues as they occur over time. So guardians could advocate for the restoration and protection of ecosystems that have been harmed, and this would emphasize their importance beyond just economic considerations. Now, of course, what this means is that in a very practical legal sense, we're talking about expanding the moral and the community, and also the community of rights holders. So this model of legal standing for this model would allow us to actually protect voiceless entities, and this promotes a radical shift in our social perception towards what it means to recognize a right, as well as who counts or who is a member of our broader moral community. We haven't read it yet, but we referenced it in our last video, which is Aldo Leopold's essay, The Land Ethic. The land ethic is the idea that every being is a part of our moral community. And in many ways, Christopher Stone's argument in terms of extending rights to non-human entities such as trees and rivers is a practical example of what Aldo Leopold would be arguing. Now, how does Now what we're going to do is kind of walk through kind of the key moments within Stone's essay. He actually starts by thinking about the unthinkable. And it seems unthinkable to extend rights to nature in an ordinary sense. Stone goes to argue that extending rights to previously unrecognized entities might appear radical and absurd at first glance. For instance, someone might say, really, a rock has a right? Or a tree has a right? That seems to, on the one hand, potentially degrade what it means for me as a human being to have a right. But on the other hand, we're not accustomed to thinking about that. But we can see here, just by looking at history, particularly the history of the American legal system and the American political system, that other entities who were viewed as things like slaves and women who were considered just property eventually gained their own recognition and rights within the society. So 300 years ago, the idea that women would have voting rights seemed absurd as well to the people who were living then. In the same way, we can maybe say that the idea of extending rights to natural entities may seem absurd at first glance, but ultimately it fits actually within the larger trajectory of rights development that we see within the United States, and also not just the United States, but the world overall. So Stone posits that the resistance to recognizing rights actually mirrors the historical pattern, and that this suggests that the concept, although initially strange for a lot of us, is actually part of a broader development in terms of our moral evolution overall. So this means that what we're going to do is try to think about how we can advocate for granting legal standing to natural entities such as forests, rivers, and ecosystems. And this change would actually empower these entities to actually be represented in a court of law and allow for a direct legal recourse when harms are inflicted upon them. So under the current legal framework, these objects are just viewed solely as resources. Think here about our discussion of John Locke in his notion that ultimately nature is just a resource for the creation of private property. In many ways, the American legal framework as it stands now is still along the lines of how John Locke sees it, where natural objects are just property or resources to be used. Now, depending on who owns them or who controls them, there are variations in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed, particularly if there's protections for forest and so forth. But here, the idea is more radical than that. The idea is actually granting them direct rights and protection within a court of law, not just because they're helpful. So this would enable us to actually to counter specific ecological entities which are vulnerable to exploitation. So by recognizing their rights, we can actually ensure that their intrinsic value gets honored in a practical legal sense. So this, in contrast, the existing legal framework restricts rights to human entities and their representatives, and this is often sidelining environmental concerns. Because natural objects lack the ability to speak for themselves, this means that any damages that are done to them can only be recognized through the lens of human interest or economic loss. So you might say that currently, the American legal system is anthropocentric, and it's also anthropogenic. It's anthropocentric because only human beings' harms and interests count, and it's anthropogenic because only human beings can actually generate any legal protections. So you can see here, in some sense, Stone is trying to address both of these concerns because it fails to address the larger systemic harm that's being done to the environment overall. As we see increased ecosystem loss, as we see the depletion of the natural environment, and we see massive extinction occurring across the entire world, and particularly within the United States, since this is where the American legal system operates. We see all of these things, but we don't currently have, let's put it this way, we have an absence of legal recognition for all of these things. In the meantime, this is perpetuating a cycle of exploitation that ultimately is undermining ecological integrity and harming our biosphere overall. So that means that we have to recognize that there is a rightlessness of natural objects in common law. So in common law, natural objects such as rivers and trees are not recognized as having legal rights, and this of course limits their ability. But we also recognize that there's lots of cases of environmental harm, such as pollution in streams, and so on and so forth. The question here is, how can we address these? Now, legal damage is usually related to environmental harm in terms of an economic measurement by calculating the economic loss based upon whatever injury has occurred. So the system here for thinking about the environment is also constrained to resources and thereby is economic in its orientation. So this means that what we need to do is try to argue or think through the idea of creating an independent legal standing structure for these trees. And I'm going to use trees as my example since that's what he talks about. And if we're able to do this, this recognition will allow for the direct representation of their interest in court by a human guardian. And so by granting nature this status, environmental issues can actually get addressed and we can protect these intrinsic values. So this raises the question of, that means that we have to actually be able to articulate how and what it means for natural objects to experience injuries. So natural objects, Stone argues, do experience real harm. Rivers and forests, for instance, can be harmed independent, or let's say the harm that's experienced by rivers and forests is independent or can be independent of human interest. For instance, imagine we have a polluted river. And this polluted river doesn't just lose its economic value when it's polluted, it suffers ecological damage that actually affects its health, the biodiversity, and all of the ecosystems that depend upon it, such as the fish and so forth. So recognizing these injuries as real injuries and not just only within the confines or the framework of economic loss is essential for actually creating an effective environmental protection for these entities. Now, legal recognition could improve also our environmental laws. So we do have laws which try to protect the environment. If we were able to add the notion that trees can have standing and trees or these natural entities could have guardians who can actually voice these harms in court in order to argue for their protection, this would actually improve our environmental laws. Because if courts acknowledge that rivers can be harmed, this paves the way for laws that prioritize the health of ecosystems rather than just thinking about how humans can be economically compensated for whatever losses they have endured. So this means, of course, or this incorporates the notion of shifting our societal values. The acknowledgement that nature can be injured in its own right changes the paradigm by which we recognize and understand what it means for something to be valuable and important. So put it this way, this is moving us, Stone is trying to move us away from the practical side of only thinking legally in terms of instrumental value into a practical way of recognizing inherent or intrinsic value or systemic value. So recognize these injuries would foster a deeper respect for these natural entities, which challenges and hopefully could help disrupt the perception that most of us have that these natural entities are just a resource for humans to use as they please. So this means that we need to think about natural objects as actually being legal beneficiaries, and which we could enable them to receive compensation directly for the damages that are caused. Now, ironically, of course, if a natural entity is harmed, we can't compensate it economically, but what we can do is compensate it by creating conditions in which they have to be protected or restored in some sort of way. So for instance, if a company is fined for polluting a river, the financial compensation could be allocated towards the restoration of the river itself, rather than just being distributed to the individuals who say they've been harmed, and then those individuals just use that money for whatever purposes they desire. So here we could actually redirect the compensation for harm to actually helping to restore or unharm the injury that has been caused by these pollutions and by these effects. So currently, in the current legal framework, only human plaintiffs actually get this. Now, by human plaintiffs, we should also consider that corporations, which are not humans per se, also can be plaintiffs. In the same sense, it's not completely abnormal or out of the box for us to think about these possibilities. Compensation for environmental damage often goes to human plaintiffs who demonstrate personal loss, and this sidelines the actual harm that might be created in the ecosystem or upon the ecosystem. So this practice currently eliminates the effectiveness of our environmental laws and limits our ability to actually restore the environment. So let's think about toward rights in substance, and let's think about how establishing meaningful legal protections for the environment would require more than just mere acknowledgement, but actually necessitates actionable rights with real consequences. Of course, in 72, Stone argues for this. By the time we get to 2021, the ongoing discourse highlights that environmental rights include provisions for guardians with legal authority to act on behalf of natural entities, ensuring their protection in court. So we have a future in which legal frameworks must prioritize ecological restoration, ensuring that remedies are directed towards healing ecosystems or repairing them, and not merely just economic compensation. Now, the importance of rights language in our environmental discourse. Now, Stone emphasizes that when we frame nature's interest in terms of rights, it's crucial in terms of transforming these social and legal practices. So the language of rights itself is an important element here, because rights language can empower nature and ensure that their interest, the natural interest, are recognized independently rather than merely being a benefit for human beings. So this reframing is essential ultimately for a deeper moral consciousness within our broader society at large. Now, what are some of the challenges? Now, recognizing legal rights for nature might alter societal perceptions, as we've mentioned, and this might lead to a shift in how humans relate to the environment, or at least that's what we hope. But importantly, it could lead to a shift in terms of how we relate to the environment in an actual legal framework. And so this change could foster a deeper sense of responsibility and care towards them, encouraging stewardship and protection. So this means that entities like the Sierra Club could bring lawsuits on behalf of natural entities that are harmed, or for instance, another example, a court could appoint a guardian for a natural entity to speak on behalf of that natural entity, for instance, when a development project is being considered or being challenged in court. And this could deepen our ecological consciousness as well as improve the conditions of the environment, promoting values for respect of nature and the interconnection that it has with all of us and our living beings. And ultimately, maybe this would actually even transform our sense of civic identity itself, where ecological protection becomes something of a fundamental principle and not just a one-off debate that is had by environmentalists. As rights for nature gain traction, society might very well view environmentalism as a form of civic duty. And I actually think that over time, we're seeing this actually take place. So this means at the end of the day, we need to begin this process of rethinking our relationship with nature in terms of this fundamental shift by acknowledging that nature can actually be a rights-bearing subject. And this would transform our environmental practices as well as our legal framework overall. So this is a kind of broad stroke tour of some of the elements that Christopher Stone talks about in his essay, Do Trees Have Standing? At the end of the day, the basic argument is we should grant these legal rights to non-human entities and enable guardians to voice them, and such that trees could have standing. Trees can be harmed, but that we would need guardians in order to protect them. But that by doing so, this would actually improve our environmental laws and actually help to create a greater awareness of the importance of the intrinsic value that natural entities may hold. With that said, I hope this has been a sort of good summary for the essay for you and giving you a sense about how we might actually think about the importance of granting legal standing to non-human entities. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys online.